Get in the car, the Hulk snapped, lumbering off in that direction. Daniel and Brian sprinted after him, throwing themselves into the back seat and slamming the doors. The Hulk started the car, headlights off, and eased out onto the forest road. Daniel's heart was pounding in his ears. He looked out the back window. The headlights were sweeping through the trees, drawing ever closer to the train station. "Who the hell would be driving out here?" Brian asked, his breath coming short. The Hulk shrugged. "Maybe nobody. Maybe somebody taking the train. Could be anyone. People live out here." Brian looked at Daniel, stunned. "Oh, shit," he said. "What?" "We're in the car." "My God, Brian, thanks for telling me. Otherwise, I wouldn't have known." "Why are we in the car?" "Because somebody's trying to kill me, Brian." "Yeah, this fucking guy!" Daniel leaned forward. "Hey, Dylan? What kind of monitoring does this car have?" The Hulk smiled, rather smugly, Daniel thought. "None. Thank Alan's paranoia." Daniel settled back. "Okay, Brian," Daniel said. "It looks like you're in this neck deep already, so I might as well tell you the whole thing." "The whole thing? There's a whole thing? Dude, what the fuck is going on here?" "That's what I'm about to tell you," he said. He began at the beginning, with the meeting in the back room of the club. He told Brian everything he could remember about what had happened afterward, all the relevant details anyway. And by the time he got through the mugging of the night before, Brian was staring at him in horror. "Shit, dude," he said. The Hulk made a noise in the back of his throat. "Makes sense why you're staying out here tonight," he said. "Alan probably got wind of it all and decided to ship you out before somebody could get around to keeping their word." You think it's because of the project?" Brian asked, his voice shaking. Daniel shrugged. "I don't know. It was the only thing they were interested in." "Dude, what the fuck are they gonna do to me?" That was an unpleasant thought. If people were trying to kill Daniel just for knowing about the code in question, what would they do to Brian, who was writing it? I don't know, Daniel admitted. Jesus, dude, I didn't even think about that. Brian buried his face in his hands. "What the fuck did you get me into, man?" "Figure it out inside," the Hulk said, stopping the car. "We're here." Before them was a 2-story house, nestled between the trees, dark save for a small yellow light above the front door. The Hulk squeezed out of the car and stretched broadly. Daniel realized that his voice was hoarse from talking. They'd probably been on the road for an hour, and he'd been talking most of the way. Overhead, the Milky Way was now fainter, likely washed out by the fresh-risen moon. There was a strange quality of noisiness in the woods. It was not silent, far from it, but it was not the electric hum and industrial roar of the city. It was a strange and unfamiliar conglomeration of sound, of chirps and whirs and buzzes, of creaks and groans, of rustles and rattles, and all of it invisible in the darkness. Daniel only paused for a moment before he followed the Hulk to the door, which the huge man had just unlocked. Brian was close on Daniel's heels. The Hulk flicked on the lights as he walked in, and Daniel halted just inside the door, staring at the interior of the house, which was unlike anything he'd seen before. The walls were paneled in wood and hung with photographs. Pictures of verdant landscapes and rocky cliffs, pictures of gleaming cities, pictures of the distant and alien landscapes of the moon and Mars. Spattered amongst them were photos of Alan and the Hulk, including one of the two of them in a church, their hands twined, both of them decked out in tuxedos, surrounded by flowers and grinning their heads off. There was a small hallway leading in from the front door, which opened onto a large, high-ceilinged room, tastefully furnished and lushly carpeted. There was a large fireplace, a larger bookshelf, and a set of sliding glass doors that opened out onto a dark balcony. There were other doors leading off of the front room to various other rooms and hallways. There was a notable lack of television, computers, or anything more complicated than lights running off of electricity. "Make yourselves at home," the Hulk told them. "You kids like lasagna?" Said Daniel, taken by surprise. I guess. "Purple?" "Huh?" said Brian. "You like lasagna?" Yeah." "Either of you got food allergies?" They shook their heads. "Make yourselves at home," the Hulk said again, and padded off into the house. "Dude, what the fuck?" Brian whispered. "This place is crazy." "Yeah," Daniel agreed. He wandered into the front room. The furniture was upholstered in dark green, subtly patterned fabric, and was round-edged and low. There was a large couch and coffee table in front of the fireplace, 2 armchairs and a little desk with a lamp over by the bookshelf, and another, larger recliner facing out towards the balcony. Daniel found himself standing in the center of the room, just trying to take it all in. He could hear the Hulk clattering around in a room down the hall, presumably the kitchen. "Hey, Brian said, looking down at his phone. I don't have any signal." "Sure don't," the Hulk cried from the kitchen. "No internet, no phone." "What?" cried Brian. What do you mean no internet, no phone?" The Hulk poked his head out of the first door on the right down the hallway. "I mean no internet, no phone. Not much of a safe house if it's on the grid." "That's paranoid as shit," Brian said. The Hulk snorted. "Been trying to tell Alan that for years." He went back to whatever he was doing that was making all the clattering noises. "You guys live here?" Daniel asked. "No," the Hulk answered. "Just come here on weekends, days off, vacations. Have a place in town for all the other time." "So, what do you do for fun?" Brian asked. Daniel put a hand over his eyes. "You're a fucking idiot, Brian," he said. "What? No internet, remember? It means no games, no nothing. I mean, there's books, I guess, but how long can you—" "Brian," Daniel said, taking him by both shoulders. "They're married." "So?" said Brian. "You're hopeless," Daniel told him, shaking his head and walking away to inspect the bookshelf. "What?" The Hulk poked his head out again. "Mostly we have a lot of sex," he said. "Don't usually have guests, though." Daniel looked over at Brian, who had gone red as a beet. "Oh," he said. The Hulk chuckled at him and vanished again. "You're a fucking idiot, Brian," Daniel said again. "How was I supposed to know? And anyway, we're still gonna be bored as shit because there's nothing to do." "There's a home theater upstairs," the Hulk called. "Lots of movies. Careful of the black folder." "Why? What's in the black—" Daniel towed Brian off before he could finish the sentence. They spent the time until the lasagna was done, rooting through Alan and the Hulk's movie collection, which consisted largely of old action flicks with graphics that were laughably bad. There were a few rom-coms and sci-fi movies strewn in, and a large folder set aside for really ancient black and white films. Jesus, Brian commented, scrolling through. Holy shit, look at this! This one's from 1936! I didn't know they were making movies back then. Yeah, dude, Daniel said. Film was invented in, 1820. Brian frowned. I thought it was 1920. Daniel shrugged. What's the difference, right? 100 years was a big deal, even back then. Stuff still changed pretty quick, and people only lived to be 80 anyway. Yeah, Brian, I know, I took history in high school too. Movie look any good? I don't know, said Brian. It's black and white. So? I don't like black and white. It's probably got a really low frame rate too. All those super old movies do. Daniel shook his head. Where do you even get movies this old? Brian shrugged. People probably just kept copying them over when they updated their libraries. What I want to know is where they got paper books. Tons of places have paper books. Libraries, Brian said. Tons of libraries have paper books. When was the last time you saw a real, physical book in somebody's house? Nobody sells paper books anymore, except, novelty shit. That bookshelf down there must have cost a fucking fortune. I guess, Daniel conceded. Check if they have Spaceman Spiff. It seems up their alley. As it turned out, they didn't, but really getting to root around through a comprehensive record of a couple's taste in films was more fun than a movie anyway. Dinner was quiet and awkward, the conversation nearly non-existent. The three of them sat at a small wooden table, clearly built for two, with a non-matching chair dragged up to it for the Hulk. Daniel and Brian were crammed onto one side of the table, and were still having to occasionally dodge elbows. Daniel would have preferred to take the food and run, to go eat somewhere else with just Brian, but when a man bigger than you and your best friend combined tells you dinner's on the table, you don't argue. Find anything good? The Hulk asked. Nah, Brian said. Not really kind of stuff. My kind of stuff. Too bad. Silence descended again, or as close to silence as one could get with the noises of the night outside. Daniel had to admit that the lasagna was pretty good, especially after not having eaten literally all day. How long is it going to be until we can go home? Daniel asked. The Hulk shrugged. Depends on what Alan finds out tonight. He's checking to see if the people who threatened you were serious about killing you. Why did you bring me here? The Hulk looked down at his lasagna. Alan can explain better. Well, Alan's not here. The Hulk sighed and leaned back in his chair, looking at the ceiling. We found out somebody came after you. Doesn't matter how. Alan's got sources. So we came to get you before they could. Nobody knows this house is out here except us, so figured you'd be safest here until we could pick up if anybody was serious about killing you. Why would someone want to kill me? Said so yourself. They told you not to talk and you blabbed all over hell and gone. But how do you know about that? You didn't know until I told you in the car. Alan's got sources. I trust him on this kind of stuff. You kids done with those plates? The Hulk collected the dinnerware and set to work washing it. Brian started walking out, noticed Daniel wasn't following, and shot him a questioning look. Give me a second, he said quietly, gesturing to the Hulk. Brian made a sour face, but walked out of the room. Daniel took a deep breath and addressed the Hulk again. "What's Phoenix?" he asked. He saw the huge shoulders stiffen. "Don't talk about that here." "Why? You said this place was safe." "Safe in more ways than one." He paused, then sighed. "Kind of a point of contention between Alan and me." "But what is it?" He shrugged. "A bunch of people who are sick of being lied to," he said, "and willing to do whatever it takes to get the truth. People who aren't willing to sacrifice liberty for security. People who have smelled a rat and are tired of waiting for the exterminator to show up." He looked over his shoulder at Daniel. "People like us." "You seem to know a lot about them." He turned back to the dishes. "I met a few of them. We talked." "About what?" Daniel blurted, before he could stop himself. The Hulk chuckled. "Mostly about what we're gonna do to the bastards in charge when we get to them." "Oh," said Daniel. He did not inquire further. He left the room without another word, resisting the temptation to back away slowly. It didn't help that he'd felt a surge of vicious camaraderie at the Hulk's words. He tried to shake it off. Much as he'd like to find the person who'd killed his father, who'd shipped him off to an asteroid and murdered him 100 million miles from home, that wouldn't fix anything. He had to keep reminding himself that it wouldn't fix anything. Back in the main room, Brian was lying on the couch, staring at the ceiling fan as it spun lazily. "No internet," he said. "No phones, no games, and all their movies suck. Dude, this is the worst kidnapping ever." "Nobody's holding a gun to your head or beating the shit out of you," Daniel snapped. "So from personal experience, no, it isn't." There was silence for a moment. "Sorry, dude," Brian said. There was a heaviness in his voice, an unaccustomed note of gravity. Daniel sighed. "No, I'm sorry. I'm kind of losing it with everything that's... It was uncalled for." "But true," said Brian, and sat up. "You know, I've been thinking." "About what?" "About the project. About why someone would be willing to kill over it." "And?" Brian sighed. "When I got given 9441, I thought it was going to be great. I thought, hey, I'm finally moving up in the ranks. Turns out I think they just gave it to me because they could afford to lose me. It shouldn't have been you getting kidnapped and beaten up. It should have been me." "That's fucking stupid, Brian." "No, but think about it. It's my project. It's my responsibility. Seriously, if it hadn't been for Her Highness and, everybody, you wouldn't even know about it. It wouldn't fix anything if it was you instead of me. It might be worse. You wouldn't have crazy, paranoid friends to kidnap you to a safe house. You might be dead already." Brian shivered. "Yeah, I thought of that," he said. "I still wish you'd never found it. You told me the password to it." I know, but I didn't mean to. I got so goddamn tired of carrying it around by myself. I was tired of keeping it secret. I thought it couldn't do any harm if I just told you. But I couldn't tell you because I'd get fired faster than you can say hobo." He sighed again. "I guess I was wrong. It did do harm. Whole goddamn lot of harm, and now somebody's trying to kill you because of my code. How much do you know about it? Brian shook his head. Not much, actually. I just write what they tell me to. Just that there's this terrorist group, Phoenix, and they're in San Fran, and 9441 is a way to catch them. They didn't tell me much else. So, how come nobody's ever heard of them? Because that's the point of terrorists, Brian answered wearily. They want to be noticed, so the guys in charge are doing everything they can to make sure they don't. He paused, swallowing heavily. You remember that mining rocket back in January? The one that blew up on the launch pad at Hadfield? Yeah, Daniel said. It killed like 30 people, right? He got a sinking feeling in his stomach. That wasn't an accident, was it? Brian shook his head. No, it wasn't. But it got covered like one and treated like one, and maybe a dozen people outside of Homeland Security know the truth about it. Not even the families know. So why do you? I didn't believe the guys from Homeland when they told me what the project was about. So they told me all about what really happened over at Hadfield. Showed me the video Phoenix left for them. It was bad. Startled, Daniel said, They left a video? Yeah. Wanted it shown on the news. Apparently they sent it to every major news station in the US. Not to mention posting it all over Hell and Gone on their own. Must have been a nightmare to contain. I think they had to put up a virus to eat it in the end. Things were clicking together in Daniel's head. That's why there's no footage of the explosion, he said in hushed tones. Because the virus ate those, too. Right? That's why nothing and nobody can manage to post a video about it, because the virus is still keeping anything from going up in case Phoenix is still trying to. Christ. Brian nodded. It's bad. There's no telling what else they've done. What we've been told was an accident that wasn't. Daniel felt sick. Why? He croaked. Why would they do that? Blow up a rocket with 30 innocent people inside? Fucking hell, dude, to scare the shit out of people. Can you imagine what people would have done if they'd known? Whole fucking country would have lost their shit. Being in a state of partial shit loss himself, Daniel had to admit that Brian was right. There would have been panic. There would have been chaos. There would have been, well, terror. What the fuck do they want? Daniel said, almost to himself. I don't know, dude, Brian said. Nobody told me that. They sat in silence for a moment, staring at the corners of the room. There was the sound of a car door slamming outside. The Hulk eased into the room. That'll be Alan, he commented, then paused, taking in the haunted expressions of the two coders. The hell happened to you two? The door opened, and Alan stumbled in, holding a hand against his side and swaying where he stood. Vivid, red blood was leaking through his fingers and dribbling from his lips. Honey, I'm home, he croaked, and keeled over onto the floor. Christ, the Hulk hissed, dashing to Alan's side and apparently forgetting all about Daniel and Brian. The pale, twig-like man was coughing up blood on the soft rug. Daniel shot to his feet, then stood, frozen, watching. The Hulk sat Alan up gingerly like a child tending to an injured pet. Where'd they get you?
Nice to see you too,
Alan said, between gasps. He coughed up a huge mouthful of blood. It was hard to imagine how a man so pale could have such brilliantly red blood, and how a man so small could have so much of it.
Christ, Alan,
the Hulk said, his voice strained.
It's your lung. Should have been a doctor,
Alan gasped.
You get a medical degree? Observations like that? You need a hospital. Paging Dr. Dillon.
He vomited out a great gout of blood. It splattered all over the Hulk, all over the rug, all over Alan. His voice was scarcely a murmur.
No hospitals. You know I don't do hospitals. Alan.
His whole slight frame shuddered. His voice had lost its tone of joviality.
Kid, medbay. Under sucking chest wound.
The Hulk turned to Daniel, who could suddenly see the tears running down the huge, flat face. Third door on the left. Go! Daniel couldn't move, not even his eyes. There was so much blood. Go! The Hulk roared, and Daniel's body scurried into motion on instinct alone. He rushed to the hall and encountered Brian already sprinting back with a chest-sized med kit in his hands, the biggest one Daniel had ever seen. He plastered himself against the wall to let Brian by. The other coder dropped to his knees beside Alan and the Hulk, flinging open the med kit. The Hulk was barking instructions. Alan had passed out and was lying limp on the floor as the Hulk unwound clear plastic tubes and fist-sized electric pumps out of the kit. Brian was pressing something against Alan's side, his arms locked and straining, blood leaking out over his hands. Alan wasn't breathing. There was blood everywhere, blood on everything and everyone, and it was seeping into the carpet. The Hulk was feeding one of the clear plastic tubes into Alan's slack mouth. One of the little pumps started whirring, and the tube filled up with blood, too, spitting it out into a plastic sack in the medkit. Alan was still not breathing. The Hulk was crying, and Brian's face was set harder than chiseled stone. Someone was praying, and Daniel realized it was his own voice. His hands clutched around a rosary he no longer carried, his words fervent and meaningless. The Hulk leaned over Alan and breathed into his mouth, making the thin and bloodied chest swell. A couple of bubbles squeezed out through the plastic tube. The Hulk pressed 2 fingers to Alan's throat, waited, then breathed into him again. He came away with a face stained in blood, but shortly after Alan's chest rose up on its own, brief and shallow, but breathing nonetheless. Brian's hands were drenched in blood. He continued holding the bandage against Alan's side until the Hulk could wrap it properly, winding gauze around the thin chest until Alan looked like a half-made mummy. Finally, the 2 of them sat back, looking down at Alan, who was still unconscious, but breathing. The thin plastic tube was pumping out less blood now, although there was still a significant amount of fluid running through it. Brian looked over at the Hulk, shell-shocked and green around the gills.
Bathroom?
He said. The Hulk pointed. Brian staggered to the toilet and started vomiting. Daniel finally found something useful to do in holding his purple hair out of the way for him. Eventually, Brian sat back against the wall, and Daniel slid down next to him, trying to ignore the blood on his friend's fingers.
Fuck,
said Brian, shakily. Daniel leaned over and embraced him, awkwardly, one arm around his shoulders. Brian latched onto him like a pneumatic clamp and started crying. Daniel patted his back, self-conscious, feeling lost and completely, utterly, totally useless. Eventually, Brian calmed down and pulled away from Daniel. Jesus, he said. I gotta wash all this fucking blood off my hands. Daniel looked down at himself. There were red handprints and smudges on his polo. The second shirt ruined in as many days. At this point, it was just adding insult to injury. Brian was scrubbing his hands under water so hot it was steaming. You'll burn yourself, dude, Daniel said tiredly. Don't care, Brian answered, scrubbing furiously. After a moment or two, Daniel said, What you did back there was amazing. Brian snorted. You mean the vomiting or the uncontrollable sobbing? I mean, you saved his life. No, I didn't. The big guy saved his life. I just squashed a red rag into his sucking chest wound. Yeah, and I stood there like a fucking idiot, and the big guy couldn't do anything without a medkit, which you probably broke a land speed record on your way to get. Brian shrugged, still scrubbing. The soapy foam was bright pink. I volunteered with a disaster response team for a while back in high school. My mom made me do it. I thought she was fucking paranoid, but I guess it paid off. I guess it did. You're seriously gonna burn your hands. Reluctantly, Brian nudged the faucet to slightly more reasonable temperatures. Fucking blood everywhere, he groused. He was still white as a sheet, his eyes a little wider than was considered sane. Daniel couldn't imagine he himself looked much better. He was having trouble getting off of the floor. Okay, he admitted. It's official. Worst kidnapping ever. Brian laughed nervously. You're the expert, he said, his voice squeaking with false levity. Daniel sighed and hugged his knees to his chest, resting his forehead on them. I just want to go home, he said. You and me both, man, Brian said, pumping more soap into his hands. You and me both.